Could we record the first slide of Catherine's presentation, please?
Sure. Let me pull that one up.
Sorry about that.
No problem. Can you see my screen?
No.
No, okay.
Well, you probably have to share it.
Let me just share it. Okay, you should be able to see it now?
Yes.
Great, okay, and let me just go up to the top. Okay, so you want me to do the first two slides?
Yes, the presentation and the next slide.
Okay. My name's Catherine Wall, and I work at MIT as an internal usability and accessibility consultant, and I'm going to be talking about the user interview, a research method that I think is a particularly versatile and useful method for getting user feedback. User interviews are a very common user research method. It is where the researcher talks directly with the user in a one-on-one conversation, and it can be done repeatedly throughout the life of a project, from the beginning to the end. Is that good? And have goals that are too broad, and I think keeping narrow and clear goals is very important before you start the interview process. You want to know what it is you want to learn from your users. Secondly, you need to recognize and eliminate bias. This is a very hard thing to do because we're all human. And sometimes we are very excited about a product or a website or an application, and we want everyone to be as excited as we are. And we lead our users. We want them to tell us how great it is, and we don't really want to hear the negative feedback. There are also times when we think a product or a website is in particularly bad shape, and we're very negative about it, and sometimes users are not negative about it, and we need to be open to that. So it's important to not let your own biases get in the way and your own opinions. The other thing is to listen carefully. When talking to users, we need to listen to them, and sometimes that means that we need to be quiet. And again, that can be very difficult when we're excited about a product and we want to show a user all sorts of features and functionality. The other challenge I wanted to mention is recording the session. I think we all just learned that this morning with our Google Hangout. We're working with technology. Sometimes it can be buggy, sometimes it can be difficult, and that can be a real challenge. We also can make our users very nervous when we're recording them, and we need to think about how they're going to react to that. We also need to make sure we have the proper consent forms if we're recording a session, either video or audio. In the United States, we have some laws about that, and in some states like Massachusetts, where Chris and I work, the laws are particularly stringent. And finally, you need to give yourself the time to analyze the data. It doesn't do you any good to go out and talk to users and do fantastic interviews if you don't come back and really look at the data you've collected and synthesize it and present that in a meaningful and usable way. So now I want to talk about how versatile user interviews are. This is a picture of a Swiss Army knife. It has many gadgets on it and can do many, many things. And that's how I think about user interviews. The first way that user interviews are versatile is in location, where you actually do the interview. I have 3 pictures on the screen. One is of 2 people talking in person, which means that you can do your interviews one-on-one in person in a small office in someone's home, in someone's office. But sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes our users are far away, just like we're far away right now, and we need to think about what technology we can use to bridge that gap. So I have another picture of a telephone. Sometimes all you need is a cell phone to call someone and have a conversation over the phone. That will work. Also, the third picture is of an iPad, and you can do just what we're doing today. If you want to talk to someone face-to-face but not in person, you can use Skype or a Google Hangout or WebEx or GoToMeeting and have that conversation one-on-one. It's nice, too, to use that technology if, like today, we want to share a screen and look at something. Interviews are also very versatile in terms of format. You can structure your questions so that you're asking very, very specific, detailed yes or no questions. Or you can have an unstructured format where you're talking in general terms. What are your thoughts about this product in general? Or what are your thoughts about a topic in general, like online banking or registering for classes? Also, your questions can be workflow oriented, how a user does something, or they can be focused on a specific task. How do you register for your classes specifically? Oops. The other thing I really like about user interviews is that your format can vary. Where I work at the university, sometimes I need to talk to professors who are extremely busy, and they don't want to sit down with me for an hour to talk about an application. They'll give me 15 minutes maybe. So I need to think about that, and I can tailor an interview that is 15 minutes long, but I do need to plan for that in advance. If you're lucky enough to have an hour or an hour and a half, you can really use that time well. The other great thing about user interviews is that you can really do them at any time in product development. It's great to do user interviews when you're gathering requirements and creating a specification for an application. That way you can really find out how your users approach a particular problem, what problem you're solving. You can also do it when you have prototypes. Paper prototypes are fantastic to use for user interviews because they're not finished, and you can get a lot of detailed feedback. You can also do a user interview with a coded design, something that is clickable, like a wireframe, or even a partially coded site. And then, of course, you can do user interviews at alpha beta release or do it during quality assurance testing. And even at the final stages, when you're doing documentation and training, it's great to talk to people at that point about how they're actually using an application. So now that we've talked about why I think user interviews are so great and the different ways that we can use them, I'd like to talk a little bit about how you actually do user interviews. And I think there are really three pieces to a user interview. There's the preparation, which can be significant and you should never ever skimp on. There's the conducting the interview, actually talking to the person. And then there's the analysis and reporting piece of it. In terms of preparation, it's very important, as I said, to set goals. And you want to set reasonable goals. If we're looking at an online banking application, it's really not reasonable to go out and think you're going to learn in an hour from one individual all about all of their banking needs. You probably need to focus on some reasonable goals. Do you want to learn how they pay bills? Do you want to learn how they transfer money? And I think that you need to be clear about those goals with your client. You definitely want to have your project team on the same page in terms of the goals. You also, I think, need to be clear about what you cannot expect to get out of the user interviews. Users are not designers, and it's never a good idea to go out on a user interview and ask a prospective user what color a button should be. Something specific like that is really a contextual issue, and that's something that you could maybe talk about in usability testing. It's a design choice, and you can get feedback about that button, but you're not going to ask the user exactly how you should design the application. And I think it's important to make that clear to the project team, because sometimes there can be misconceptions that we're going out to talk to users and they're going to tell us exactly what we should do. Choosing your participants to interview is also very important. You want to know who your audience is. If we go back to our example about online banking, do you want to talk to people who already do online banking? Do you want to talk to people who've never done it? Are you talking to people who are experienced, who are novices? Sometimes the applications that Chris and I work on here at the university, we may need to talk to managers. It may be important to interview managers about how their staff will use an application. Sometimes it's important to talk to the people who are actually using the application. And you just want to be clear about who you're talking to. You also want to plan your schedule carefully. I think it's important to let people know how much time you're going to take for the interview. Make sure you have enough time to get to the user's office or home to interview them. You don't want to be late. And you also want to give yourself some time after the interview to debrief. You don't want to be rushing off to your next appointment right away. You also want to just confirm your appointments, make sure that everyone on your team who's attending the interview can be there. You don't want to be scrambling at the last minute. And you really want to spend a lot of time working on your questions for the interview. I like to come up with a draft list of questions, and then I go through and revise it. Often I have a very long list of questions that I couldn't hope to get to in one interview, and I want to cut that down. And then I want to make sure that my questions aren't biased, that I'm not saying something like, how do you like that? How much do you like that? We don't want to lead the individual to telling us an answer we want to hear. We want to ask questions like, can you tell me what you think of that? You said wow when you saw that paper prototype. What did you mean by wow? You want to be careful not to agree with the participants as well. And we're going to talk a little bit more about actually what happens in the interview in a minute, so I won't go into too much detail there. But you also want to think about the timing. If you're asking a very broad question, you don't want to give yourself 2 minutes in your schedule to get an answer to that. Maybe it's a question that's fairly broad, like, you know, can you tell me what you think of online banking? And you may want to have several follow-up questions that you're going to explore with the user. And you want to think about how much time you're allocating for each question in your interview. You also want to know your material very well. There's nothing worse than getting out there to talk to a user, realizing that you don't have all the information. If you're looking at a prototype that you don't understand it, that can be embarrassing, and it makes the user not really interested in, not really invested in going through with the interview. So now I want to take a few minutes to talk about tools. I have pictures on the screen of a digital voice recorder, a pencil, and a video recorder. You can use any or all of these tools for recording the information from your sessions. It's important to have the right tools for the situation. It's important to know how they work, and if you're working with others, often Chris and I work together when we do interviews, it's important to know what your role is in the interview. If I'm going out and Chris is going to be talking with the individual, then I'm going to be taking notes, and I need to know if I'm going to be running the video recorder and writing down quotes as we go, if I'm just writing down quotes. I want to make sure that I have batteries for my video recorder and my audio recorder so that all that will work smoothly. And then once you get to the interview, it's time to set expectations for the user, for your participant. And I have a picture here of someone setting a table, and that's a little bit how I like to think about this process. You want to make sure that you introduce yourself to your participant, that you make them comfortable, that they know what you're doing and what you're there for. It often happens, especially if you're working with someone who's recruiting participants for you and you have not had contact with them, that they don't quite understand what you're there for. And you want to make that very clear. And you also want to make sure that they're comfortable enough that they're going to talk to you and be honest with you. In the interview itself, one of the most important things that I found I need to do is to listen. And I need to listen very carefully to what the participant is telling me. There are often times where a participant will be telling you what you want to hear because they really want to please you, and you need to listen carefully for that and think about ways you can ask questions to get beyond that. Interviewing people is observe what's around me. This is particularly true if you're going out to someone's office or someone's home to do an interview. I can't tell you how many times I've been to an office and the participant tells me how wonderful the tool is and it's so helpful and everything is there, and I look at their computer and I see little post-it notes all over the computer. And I ask what the post-it notes are, and I find out that they are for all the information that's missing from the application or all the information they need to have handy. And it's very useful to pay attention to those details. I also really try to clarify what the users are saying. I listen and then I try to repeat back to them what they've said to make sure I've understood it clearly. Chris and I last year were doing some interviews around a complex reporting tool that some scientists on campus were going to need to use. And it was very complex, and we talked to one individual who said, if you make me use this tool, I will leave science. And it was really important to ask him to clarify that for us. If we had just written down, I'm going to leave science, I don't think we really would have gotten much out of that. But when we asked him to tell us a little bit more about what he meant, we understood more about how the tool was getting in the way of him doing his research and doing a good job at it. The other thing you want to do is be able to record quotes. If you're using a recording device like a video recorder or an audio recorder, sometimes I jot down the time so that I know where to go on my tape to look for the quote. Sometimes I'm just writing quotes down, and I want to make sure that I get them accurately recorded, because this is a great thing to report back to your client, what the participant actually said. Nothing can be really more powerful than that. The quote that I just mentioned about I'm going to leave science was a pretty powerful quote, and we wanted to make sure we got that right. And now this is a picture of a jack-in-the-box with a big question mark popping out of it, and you need to always be ready for surprises in the interview. Chris and I have seen some pretty interesting things here over the years when we interview people. Sometimes people will say things that you're not quite ready for. Sometimes they show up with, they want to bring 2 people to the interview instead of 1. And you have to be ready to kind of talk the participant out of that, make adjustments, and not be flustered by it. So after your interview, it's time to analyze and report out your results. And what you really want to do is look at your data and try to get some ideas of what the major themes are. You know, were participants talking about workflow issues? Was it user interface issues? Is it a training issue that's coming out of it? But what the major theme of your interview was. Also, I think it's very important, as I said, to include quotes from actual participants. I think it can be very powerful for them to see what your participants actually said. I also think it's important, if you can, to try to deliver the results in person. It's good to have a paper report that you hand over, but also to maybe just have a brief 30-minute meeting where you can talk about what you learned. I think it makes a big difference to the project team to hear that in person and to have you point out the details in the report that you think are important. So finally, just to summarize what we've talked about, when it comes to user interviews, I think it's very important to prepare thoroughly, be mindful of bias that you could bring to the interview, to listen very carefully and to record your quotes accurately. And that's all I have. If you have questions now, I'd be happy to take them. If not, you can always email me, and there's my email at gmail.com. Thank you very much. Now, Marta, I will turn the screen, I will stop sharing my screen. Can I do that? Oh, yeah.
Cancel. Is it canceling? Is that canceling the dialog box or the screen share?
Okay, so are we still sharing the screen? Okay. And if anybody has questions, I'll read them out loud so we're not unmuting the microphones. You can type them in the chat box if you want.
Me.
Oh, hi, Freddie.
Hello.
Yes, I have a question. You mentioned that it's important to define goals and the client knows exactly what to expect and what don't to expect. Usually, when we conduct this kind of test, there is like a temptation of trying to create deductions, no, from using the same test. How do you, in the first process of defining the methodology and the test, restrict the bias and the external impact of the environment, the external distractions in one specific test? How do you protect that the results are directly comes directly from the objectives of your test? I don't know if I made myself clear.
I'm just thinking about your question a little bit. Sometimes, let me take a stab at it and see if I'm there. Sometimes it does happen that we have an objective for a test, like we want to go out and we want to learn how these professors, we're going to use this science reporting tool. And none of the professors wanted to talk about how they were using that tool because they all were so frustrated by it. Mm-hmm. So we had to kind of change the objective of our test. When we came back and reported what we had talked about, we had to talk about how frustrated they were with this process and how the tool didn't make a difference, and so our client had wanted us to go out and talk about the tool, and we figured out during the process of the interviews that there was a major problem with this policy directive, and we had to kind of regroup and talk about that. Is that kind of what you're talking about, that situation?
Yes, exactly. I wanted to know how, in a specific circumstance, you have one specific object that usually you cannot ask the people that you cannot share with your interviewers which is your objective. So you have to take another path in order to try to get answers. But in that path or in that work, you also face another challenge, is that people, when they start thinking, they used to adapt the answer to maybe a better answer, or they try to put some words or adjectives to make it sound better. No, in this rational process, we all imagine some results or think that we did in that way. So there is always like a internal bias that we need to pay attention in order to protect the result.
Exactly.
There is, I would say, on the community here, people tend to be quite honest, and if they don't like something, they will be quite direct about not liking it. So that makes the job of interviewing easier. I would say, to your point, another thing that we've run into with interviews particularly is we have the team wants us to look at the user interface. Is the user interface usable? Mm-hmm. And what we've run into, particularly with interviews, is people say the interface itself is fine, but the entire process or workflow is very broken. And as to Catherine's point, so we come back and the user interface is fine. People don't have complaints about that, but they have complaints and issues about the overall process. Mm-hmm. And sometimes project teams can't quite understand that because that's a much more difficult issue to come to terms with and understand and fix, where the user interface in some ways is easy to fix. But the overall process, if it's very confusing, is difficult to fix.
And a lot of times what we do in those situations is we try to divide the interview and to really listen to the user's feedback about the process and how broken that is, but also to get them to think a little bit about the interface, you know, to do a little bit of both, so that we're satisfying our clients' objectives, but also serving the larger goal of getting user feedback and reporting that out clearly. Mm-hmm. Does that answer your question as well, Marta?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. We have another question.
Of course.
Great.
Andres.
Okay. Have you ever been in a situation where you feel that an interview might not be enough to answer all of your questions? Like, I mean, you find that the person you're interviewing is telling you what you want to hear, but his body language maybe is telling you another thing.
Yes, that is very, very common in an interview. And what you have to do then as the interviewer is ask some follow-up and some clarifying questions to kind of get at the heart of that. So sometimes we'll say, you know, that's really interesting. You said you really liked the screen, and I'd like to know a little bit more about it. But you did make sometimes we'll say, ooh, but you jumped back when you saw it. You know, what was that about? Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And sometimes we circle back and we just keep asking questions in different ways over and over again to get at the real heart of it.
This is also particularly common in usability tests when you're doing testing. Quite often you'll have participants do a set of tasks and they might not do them the way we thought, or they just might fail the task, or the user interface is very difficult to use. And then when you use follow-up questions at the end, quite often we've had the situation where they'll say, yes, that works fine, that was great, I thought it was easy, when they couldn't complete the task. So you just have to kind of ask a lot of questions and continue to kind of ask in very different ways to understand what they really mean. Because a lot of times people don't want to, although we are very open here in this community, a lot of times people aren't going to be completely honest or don't want to feel like they're going to say something that might not make them feel like they know what they're talking about.
Yeah, we also use some questionnaires, particularly when we do usability testing. I don't know if you're familiar with the System Usability Scale questionnaire. It's a very old 10-question questionnaire. Yeah, Marta's nodding her head. She's heard of it. The SUS is very common, but it's really interesting to look at how people answered those questions, especially if they didn't complete the tasks, but they say on the SUS that it was very easy, and we like to compare those and see what that tells us. Anything else?
No, I don't think so. Thank you very much, Catherine.
Okay, I'm going to turn this over to Chris then.
Now, are we okay for time? I know we're running a bit late, so I didn't know if, I mean, I'm happy to talk about surveys now. I just wanted to make sure the time is not an issue.
Oh, I don't have a problem.
Okay. 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 Sure. Just give us a second. You can edit this out when you move. There we go. Okay. I'm just going to open my slides and see if you can see them properly.
Great. Before you begin,
yes.
we had a problem with the first slide. It wasn't recorded, so maybe Catherine, after Chris finishes, can you please talk about the first slide again, and I'll edit that part back to the beginning?
Okay. No problem.
That's fine. Okay, let me just go here. Oh, that's the PDF one. Hold on, just. Okay, now.
So, are you sharing the screen?
I didn't think we unshared it, so I thought.
Just make sure you are.
Hold on, let's see. Okay, hold on. Okay, can you see my screen properly? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we see it.
Okay, okay. Just before I start, I'm Chris. I'm going to talk about surveys. I will just tell you in advance that I tend to talk fast, and I'm going to try really hard not to talk as fast as I normally do. And also, I tend to be a bit more text-heavy, so it's going to be a bit more text, but hopefully that will be sufficient for this. Both Catherine and I do both surveys and lots of user interviews, but I actually find surveys, I quite like them, and they're a very efficient way to gather a tremendous amount of information about specific data. Surveys are also, as I say, multifaceted. They can be very simple surveys. You can get statistically significant information. They can also be incredibly complex or incredibly simple, and it varies on what you're trying to learn. And sometimes when we deal with clients, we actually sometimes do different types of surveys. So if they want to obtain data, we have a survey for students, a survey for faculty, or a survey for staff, because sometimes it's easier to divide up the surveys. For the analysis and also sometimes for getting out more results, it's best to have closed questions where you're forcing a user to choose a particular choice that's given there, a multiple choice, where open-ended is where they can put their text in, and it tends to be a bit richer data, but it's also much more difficult to analyze that way. It takes a lot more time. Again, the other thing, much like user interviews, part of the problem with surveys that I find it takes a tremendous amount of time. You have to really take out subjectivity and bias. It's very easy to write questions that are somewhat leading or biased, or even if it's very subtle, you have to be very careful to not let that happen. And the way that I usually go through that is I have to write questions, then I have to go back to them 2 or 3 times and have other people look at them just to make sure the questions are clear, but mostly remove the bias. One of the things about online tools have really helped tremendously with creating surveys. SurveyMonkey is probably the most popular one. There have been several ones around. SurveyMonkey is the last one surviving. It is free. You can get a free version which only allows you to do 10 questions. You can also buy SurveyMonkey services, and they have a variety of different things to do a lot more questions. You can also do something called Logic that we'll talk more about. But SurveyMonkey is really probably the most popular and common survey tool today. There are several types of surveys. A profile survey is one where you really want to get a snapshot of the current user population that you're targeting or trying to get information about. A satisfaction survey, which is probably the most common, and many of us have received that once we've bought a product, used a service. It really wants to find out what your satisfaction level was with the product or service, what worked well, what doesn't work well. Value surveys are also ones where they want to find out what people value as most important. This is particularly important when companies are doing upgrades. They need to have a lot of different new functionality. They really would like to get a snapshot of their users, what the most important things are. So if they can only do 3 of the 6 things that are listed, they'll know what users deem the most important. Really, a survey is it's very good for particular things. It's very bad for other things. Really, it's a really good choice to use when you want to get answers to specific questions when you want to reach a large group of users, particularly when you don't have users close by and you want to be able to reach people across a wide geographic area. Surveys really aren't particularly good when you have a very open-ended or broad questions about user, want to understand a workflow. That's really much better suited to a user interview. Surveys are much more efficient when they're focused. A survey is a good method when you want to have a lot of quantitative data, which is numbers and very clear-cut black and white numbers, not qualitative data, which is more text data. Again, text is really a great way to get information, but it's a tremendous amount of time to analyze it and report out and come up with solid answers from that. User interviews are much better at that. Some of the disadvantages of surveys is the quality of data from a survey can really be uneven. It's not always clear. Sometimes users will skip certain questions, or they might respond quickly. Surveys, by their very nature, you don't spend a lot of time on, so most surveys really should be geared to be able to do in 5 or 10 minutes. As I said, a huge disadvantage of surveys is that the questions need to be really, really well written, clearly written, and free of bias. And from a UX perspective, we spend a lot of time doing that. A lot of times surveys by people who aren't trained in this will be written up quickly and sent out because it's a good way to get data, but sometimes you have to be very careful how the questions were written. Again, analysis can be time-consuming, particularly with free-form text data. And as the long discussion we had in the question is, users aren't always truthful in their surveys. We all make an effort to make sure that we tell users whenever we do surveys, it's anonymous, we do not track IP addresses, so we really would like your full and honest opinion. That tends to help a lot, but still sometimes people will not be truthful in surveys, particularly if they think it might be traced back to them, or is there any way, shape, or form that it could be traced back to them. Much similar to user interviews, you really need to figure out your goals for the survey. What do you want to learn? Again, this is also talking to your clients and stakeholders to make sure what you will and will not learn from the survey, and clearly define that just so the expectations are set. Also, clearly defining the profiles of survey participants and how you reach them is really important. Again, it depends on, are you sending out a general survey on a very topic that is relevant to everyone, or are you having a specific narrow focus on a particular set of users? That's very important to kind of understand before you send out a survey. Sample size is really important, and as you all probably know, the answer is it really depends. That's one of the main things that we say in the field of UX. But how many participants should you have for your survey? And it really does depend on the type of survey you have, what kind of information you're trying to get, making sure you actually have the right audiences. Generally, the result in the field, in the industry, is that a 10% response rate is considered quite good. So the more you send out, so if you send out 1,000 invites, if you get 100 responses, that's considered decent in the field. We particularly tend to get a lot more response rate or higher response rate at the university here because people tend to take the time. So we usually can expect a 40 or 50% return rate on the survey, which is quite good. If you don't get enough responses or the data really isn't clear, you need to report that out to say it may invalidate the survey. And there's been several times of late we've actually sent out surveys to get responses from students, and we haven't received enough responses that we deem would be valuable enough or quantifiable. For example, if sometimes it's below 50, we've sent out 500, it's below 50, we really don't feel like we can report out on that because it's just not enough of a response that we feel we can actually make conclusions and take out common themes. And we have to report that out to the client. They don't necessarily like that, but we do try to mention that before it starts. So just want to talk about some of the types of questions. I mentioned closed questions. And this is, again, where you want users to pick from a response from a drop-down list or a radio button, for example. And you really want users to choose from the answers that are given. You want to make sure the answers are as complete as possible, but it also is sometimes helpful depending on the particular type of question. Closed questions are obviously the easiest to analyze, and you can usually get results that are more clear. But you also often want to include another option because sometimes participants will not feel that the closed list of questions is really all appropriate for them. And again, it depends on your type of users. Sometimes users are happy to just choose from the list. Quite often, depending on the grouping, they insist on having another option because they really feel what they want to put is specifically different. Open-ended questions are, again, these free-form questions where participants write text in what they think the answer is. So it can be very wide and varied. These yield both complete data, but it's also complex data that, as I had mentioned several times, is very time-consuming and could be very difficult to analyze. Participants also might skip this sometimes if they're in a hurry. Again, some of the data might be difficult to interpret. One of the things that Catherine and I do with this is quite often we will sometimes go through and code things because people might use terminology that is very similar, but they're different words. So sometimes we will take that and code that to group them into certain groupings or buckets, as we call them, just so that there are common themes that we can actually use to help make it easier to analyze the data and what the people are actually responding to. One thing that we try to do with all of our surveys, and at the very end, we always have the last question is, do you have any final thoughts, comments, or suggestions? And this is one to always have, we call it a release valve at the very end, but it's also a really excellent way. So if people do have a particular concern, a gripe, or there's something they don't like, this is a way to always let them have a way to answer the question the way that they deem it's best for them to do it. So I would really suggest that in any survey, you never always have this at the end. One of the things with writing questions is we keep questions positive. You try to avoid negative statements, partly because it sets a tone, but even more importantly is negative questions are quite often more difficult to understand. This is one of the things that I had a great difficulty with when I was first learning is make sure when you write a survey question, it's only one question. Do not have multiple questions in one. This means sometimes you need to break a question into two separate questions, and that's fine. But you never want to actually have it so that there's two questions or 1.5 questions within one question in a survey, because it's confusing, and it also will not lead really to answers that will really help you when you're trying to analyze the data in the end. Also, be quite consistent in how questions are formatted. That helps people map their mental model to how they expect the survey to be. I don't know if you've heard of things called Likert scales, but it's a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 7. And this is a consistent scale. It's well known in the field. It's been used for a very long time. And what it means is you usually start from 1 to be strongly agree, 2 would be agree, 3 would be neutral, 4 would be disagree, 5 would be strongly disagree. Or you can reverse it and have 1 strongly disagree, 2 disagree, 3 neutral, agree, and strongly agree. That's very much a well-known thing in the field, and it's a really great way to understand behaviors and the way that people think. You can also often include an opt-out option so that participants don't think that question is applicable to them. They can skip. The way that I generally do that is I try to really limit the amount of required questions because I do not want to distract users who might prefer to skip questions. I only make required questions ones that are conditional upon a next question or some very basic data that you really do need to have. Having all survey questions required, or almost all, can be very frustrating for users, and it also often leads to a higher rate of abandonment of surveys. As I had mentioned before, really one of the things you need to revise, and edit your questions to get rid of potential leading or subjective wording removed. Again, as I said, I usually go through it 2 or 3 times. Depending on the time, I try to go through my survey questions 2 or 3 times, and then I'll have Catherine look at it or someone else on the project team look at it, and we'll do the same. You really kind of have to make sure your questions are not only clear and geared towards a particular audience, but they really need to be removed of bias. In my mind, writing the questions is actually even more difficult than analyzing the data, because to me those are the 2 most difficult parts of doing a survey. You also want to make sure that your survey flows in a certain way and it's grouped in a way that makes sense. One of the things that you really is best to do is always keep any demographic information in your survey right towards the end, unless you need to have it up front. But asking things about gender or particular, for us, we all quite often ask about what year they're in school or what course they're doing. That kind of information we always try to ask at the end, because you really want to ask the questions that are particularly relevant in the beginning. And the demographic information is certainly helpful, but it actually isn't as critical as the other information you're going to be getting. Survey logic is something that it's not available in the free SurveyMonkey tool, but it is really important, especially if you have surveys that can be a little bit complex. Quite often, if they have a question you ask, and one particular question, however they answer that will depend on, they can go to other parts of the survey. Quite often, survey logic is used in the very beginning, and to ask someone if they've used a particular product, and if they haven't, you say thank you and you get them out of the survey, because you want to have people that actually have an understanding or a basis of whatever you're asking about. But survey logic allows you to basically kind of go through certain questions and then route people in particular ways. Again, I said the survey tools generally include logic. One of the things about logic that's quite important is you really need to test it. I found myself when I'm quickly trying to put a survey together, I put some logic in, and I also find quite often the logic might not work, or wasn't as thorough as I should. So after writing your questions up and doing your survey logic, really you must test it internally because it's very important. And I talked a little bit about this. It's really making sure that your questions flow logically and things that are grouped logically. And at the end, we always try to have the more, we tend to kind of, the last question is always, do you have any final thoughts or comments? We've also tended to do, as we do in usability tests, the last few questions are, name 1 or 2 things you like about this product or service, and 1 or 2 things you would like change about the product and service, and then at the last question, any final thoughts. We are very conscious to not make surveys too long because people are quite willing to do surveys, we found, but they have to be quick. A general rule that we have is we never have more than 20 questions total. That way it limits people's time and also makes it digestible for people. As I've mentioned several times, you really need to test the survey, the wording, making sure the survey works, but particularly with logic. One thing that I actually felt quite embarrassed about, we have a template for sending out a survey. A couple months ago, I had it sent to a bunch of faculty members, and I actually had a generic URL of SurveyMonkey, not the exact URL. So I sent out to the first group of 40 people, and a bunch came back and said, "This isn't the link to the survey." And I realized I had not inserted the URL properly, so I had to kind of do that again. So just really testing out your survey, testing out the invitation, testing out your survey, the logic. You can't do that enough just because you really want to have people see the email or see the link and then just do the survey and not get distracted by anything else. This really is a follow-up to what I was saying. One of the things that we have found is, and this might sound kind of funny, but we tend to not send surveys out in the middle to the end of the week because there's a much less likely response rate. We've tracked this over the last few years. Sending out a survey on a Thursday afternoon or Friday quite often means it will be buried in someone's email or will get ignored. We often send, even if we have it ready, we send it out first thing Monday morning because quite often people coming into the office will see this link at the very top of their inbox and they're more likely to respond to it versus if we sent it out Thursday afternoon or Friday, it will be lower in the email inbox. And so the rate of people responding, that can make a huge difference in when you do send out a survey. Generally, we leave the survey open for about 5 business days for about a week. Sometimes we do it for 2 weeks. It really depends on how many respondents we have, how big the survey was. Often we'll go about midway through the week or halfway through our survey time that it's open. And if a response rate is not as high as we want or is a little bit low, we will often send out a reminder to people. We've been very careful because you want to be conscious of sending out a reminder to remind people, but you also don't want to irritate people because it's usually with surveys people are not getting any type of compensation or honorarium, so it's usually asking people out of their goodwill to do it. So you have to be very careful in that. That being said, sometimes we do offer incentives. Generally, for most of our surveys, we don't, but we have, to boost response rates with several surveys in the past, we've actually asked people to, if they do want to opt in at the end, to give their email address, and they can be put in a lottery, and they might can win something. I think at one point we actually offered an iPad, but we always make it very clear that if you do this incentive, we try to make our surveys always anonymous, so you have to say that we need your email address to be put into this option for the lottery to win something, but that we actually do not use, and we will kind of destroy the email addresses after the incentive is given out. You also need to make sure to be careful, do that as soon as the survey closes, to do the lottery and the incentive if you are doing one, and do that right away so people feel like it's a completely legitimate reason. Analysis. You try to want to analyze the data as soon as the survey is closed. Quite often this can be easy if you have closed questions. It's very quick to be able to see the data. Again, if you have the free-form data or you have a lot of text data, that makes it a little bit more time-consuming. A lot of the online tools now, particularly SurveyMonkey, provide lots of visual graphics and things that they will show that makes it much easier to just show patterns and trends and how people responded to questions. And again, sometimes this can be very quick. Actually, we had a survey that closed, and it was a student survey last week, and actually I finished up the report this morning, and I was going through this, and the analysis was pretty clear. People were generally satisfied with it, but one of the things that I found quite difficult was there was one part of it where half the respondents really liked this one particular thing that they had added to it, and half the respondents really didn't like it. And so one of the things that it was very difficult for me to tell in the report, I had to say, is we had on this particular topic, this one particular area, there was no common theme. There was people who were both very strongly in favor of it and liked it, and people who were very confused by it. So the result of the survey from this was that we can't give you any information on this because we just don't know because it's so conflicting. So that's an area we said for them in the next steps, we either need to do another survey and talk about this or do user interviews because this is not clear and there's no clarity on what exactly this particular topic is for the users. So be very careful with the conclusion you draw. Sometimes if it's very clear, either pro or con, or you can see, that's easy. But sometimes if, like that situation I just described, you can't really easily say what the conclusion is because it's very confusing and convoluted, and there's no clear yes or no. What we tend to do also, if we do have free-form text data, is we actually look at the raw data and we can export the data into an Excel spreadsheet or a Google Docs spreadsheet, and then we just start going over that. As I mentioned earlier, Catherine and I will often tag and find common terminology and common themes, and then just kind of do something else with that data, whether it be affinity diagramming or just combining it up to see if there are consistent trends or consistent themes that come out of that. Quite often there will be. Also, the other thing to really consider that we look at is if there's consistent questions that people skipped or there's data that's missing. If that is more than just a random amount, you have to be very careful to see if people didn't want to answer that or why they didn't answer it. Was it your questioning? Was it the topic they didn't want to discuss? Was it something that was just too sensitive? So you have to be very careful in looking at what people do and do not answer in the survey. The report, we actually generally, we try to meet with people after. That's not always an option because people are busy. We generally have a template we use for survey. It includes an executive summary. Usually we like to quote what people liked, didn't like in the executive summary. Then we'll usually have a positive what people liked about the topic that was discussed, and then the takeaways or the issues that came up. Sometimes we put it in graphs, sometimes we put it in tables. It really depends on our client. We a lot of times know our client, do they prefer something that's more visual or something that's more text-based. It really depends on our time frame, the amount of information received, things like that. What I have here is a couple examples of poor survey questions. I'm not sure how well you can see this, but the question here is, here's an example of a survey question. The material presented was the right technological depth. That was the question. And then they have a potential answers here. And so there's a couple things that are really wrong with this. This question is very leading. Is the right technological depth? What does that mean? Do you know your users? That seems very general. If the question is used, you should be using a Likert scale here, so they would say if you did use this question, even though it's kind of not great, it would be strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, or strongly disagree. The wording is also quite poor in this. It's like okay, bad, or no comments in the end. These are not examples of good survey questions. And here's another question that is particularly bad for a variety of reasons. It said, should Americans buy imported automobiles that take away American jobs? So the 5 answers we have here is definitely should not, neutral, should, definitely should. So as you can probably well imagine, this is a very leading question because the term take away American jobs. And for the type of Likert scale here, the question should be written in a different way as Americans should buy imported automobiles, or buying imported automobiles takes away American jobs, and then have strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, or strongly disagree. But the way this is written is also, there's 2 questions in one asked here. Should Americans buy imported automobiles? That's a yes or no. Or what are your thoughts on imported automobiles being bought? But then the way taking American jobs, not only is that the second question asked, that's also a very loaded question that is really kind of not helpful in trying to get answers to a question, because it's very much a skewed question. And this one is a tougher question, tougher. You might not be able to see it, but it's really a listing of the gender of a child and the age. It's asking, it has a list in their check boxes, and it has boy age 1, girl age 1, boy age 2, girl age 3. The question itself is one that might be a demographic question that needs to be asked. But you think about this, really what this can easily be done is just being able to have a drop-down box choosing male or female, or a radio button saying male or female, and then choosing the age in a drop-down box. Not only is that much easier cognitively to not have so much of an overload, it's also much easier in the screen because it saves a tremendous amount of real estate in the screen. It's also much easier to read. The way this is set up now is just tremendously potentially confusing. I know I've talked kind of fast. Please feel free to email with any questions. I also was planning on, I'll post this on SlideShare. I have an account in SlideShare, and I will send you out a link if anybody wants the slides. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Yes, thank you.
Of course.
In Mexico, we have a very long-standing tradition of not answering surveys, especially online ones. So how can you encourage people to take them when you cannot give something away?
The only way that I can think of in that situation is if people think that there is something that they're going to get out of it eventually, whether it be, if I answer this, the product will be better, the service will be better eventually, they have an incentive to help. If they don't have that, there really isn't an incentive to participate.
Yeah, I think that sometimes if people feel like they're going to be heard, like you're really going to listen to them, if you can convince them of that, they will be more likely to participate.
Yeah.
But you have to somehow convince them that they are going to be listened to.
Or their input is valued in a way that might actually help with the product or service.
Okay.
Besides that, that's a very difficult question without incentive.
Another question. I had this experience. I received a questionnaire, a very long questionnaire that was 16 pages, and I filled it out because it was my former university. Mm-hmm. So I said, okay, I'll help them out and answer what I want to get information about. It was for a newsletter, but then all the information I filled out was not used for the following newsletters I received. So I believe when you answer a questionnaire, you create an expectation that this information will be used.
We have a few fun stories about that. Yeah. With all of the things that we do, not only surveys, but also interviews or testing, we, for us, well, first off, I just say 16-page survey is awful, and if I get a survey that's long, sometimes I'll just answer it and say, I do this for a living, and this is a really bad survey, and just because it makes me feel better. I feel cranky, but it makes me feel better. But what I would also say to that is that we make it very clear, and part of the thing, whenever we're doing testing, interviews, or survey, we say we are the usability team. We are going to do this survey, interview, whatever. We will take all this information, we give it to the project team, and then they decide what to do. Our only goal is to gather the information, analyze it, and hand it to the team. The team decides what they can and cannot implement. That does kind of give us a little bit more credibility, I think. It also makes it a little bit easier most times when people realize not all the things that they said or when they were testing or whatever it was doesn't get implemented into the product. They don't see all that. So they realize it's not our fault. They usually will realize it's a process, and sometimes it takes a long time. That being said, Catherine had a very interesting situation a few months ago.
Yeah, this was from a user interview, and it was with a professor. And, you know, we listened very attentively, and he had a lot of complaints about an online grading tool. And, you know, we took those back to the project team, and they released their product, and it didn't have all the upgrades that he had requested. So he sent me a personal note and told me how disappointed he was in me that I did not fix these things, because he had specifically told me what to fix, and they weren't fixed.
And we have talked to this person many times over the years. He knows who we are. He knows where we are, that we are simply kind of people that take the information in and hand it off to the team. And he's a forceful personality, but he still felt the need to email Catherine and tell him how disappointed he was.
Yeah, and I think there's a fine line. You know, we want to let people know that they are being listened to, and that we really are taking their feedback back to the project team. We're not ignoring them, no matter how detailed, you know, or how, even if we feel like maybe their requests are ridiculous, we still need to report those out. That's what people are saying. But at the same time, we're not making decisions about what's fixed and what's not fixed.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, Andres has another question for you.
Okay.
In here in the event, when there's something for evaluation of the professors, and the incentive in this case would be that if you want to see your grades, you have to answer all the questions. And in many cases, students just answer that the teacher is great just to see their grades. So how do you know which surveys are correctly answered and not quickly answered to get the incentive you were proposing?
That's a really good question. And I would say, I think my advice would be maybe that incentive is not the best incentive, because you're, like you said, you're incentivizing people to just answer anyway to see their grades.
One of a colleague of mine, and it's kind of related to this, one of the things he always advocates is that he does a lot of usability testing, and he said as soon as someone comes into the test, he gives them the incentive, the compensation before they start, just because he doesn't want people to feel obliged. And he said sometimes they say thank you and they get up and walk out. He said he always feels like he's almost keeping people. Sometimes he'll have users that just are only doing whatever they have to do for the usability test just to get the incentive, and he's like, that's not really useful data for them. But people are just so interested in only the incentive, and they're not going to make any effort to actually think about it or do what, you know, the way they normally do it. They'll answer the way the facilitator wants them to answer. So that's one way to deal with it. I mean, part of it is there is an incentive for people to come and do this, so the incentive is a big part of it for some people. And I think that's just reality sometimes.
Yeah, I think my job as an interviewer is to engage people enough so that they want to talk to you. You know, so they might be doing it just to get the gift card or the free mug or whatever. And in your case, I think it's probably, it would be better to show people their grades and then at the end of the grades say, please take our survey, and you know, that way they're not just answering it one way.
Yeah. And then, I mean, the initiative or the thing with that is, if people get a good grade, they'll be more inclined to the survey. If they don't get a good grade, they won't be inclined to do the survey. That's a good point. Which is just, that's just natural human behavior.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. What if you see some data is incorrect? For example, you do a survey that the user has to think about it, and it'll take him 2 or 3 minutes to answer. And you see someone answered in 15 seconds. Do you take out that particular survey, or do you leave it for the statistical results?
I hate to say this, but it depends. I think if people, again, we don't always, especially with most of our surveys are online, we don't know how long people took with them. What the time that we will usually, if we have a question that we realize that is after we've sent a survey out, the question that looks it's poorly worded or it seems biased or something like that, we'll just take that question out and not include any of it. Sometimes, and that's happened with some regularity, just say we just don't even look at that question, even if there's solid answers, but we realize it wasn't done well on our part. I just won't do it.
There are, we do have some online timed surveys that we
That's
do
true.
Where we're looking at information architecture and things like that. And there are times when we will look at the times just to note if there are big differences. We may not throw out the data, but we may note that in our results that, on average it took people 10 minutes to do the survey, but we did have some people that went through rather quickly, or some people took a lot longer, and we don't know why that is.
One of the things that actually in the project teams I've tried this with usually don't appreciate it, I'll put it that way, is a lot of times we'll ask questions about, I thought this process was easy, and use that Likert scale of strongly agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree, and then randomize it. So later we'll ask the question, I thought this online process was difficult. And see, it's basically it's asking the reverse of the question we asked earlier, and just see if there's a parallel of how people respond to that. And mostly it's a way to slow people down to go through a survey. And that's actually a really good way to cross-reference to see if people actually are reading the survey and what their thoughts are. But a lot of times the project team and the clients don't like that because they think it's making the client think or making the person think too much. So we have to be very careful in how we ask that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay. And on Likert, you prefer 1 to 5 or 1 to 7?
I prefer 1 to 5 just because it's, for the most part, 1 to 5, just because I think it's less confusing. And again, as I just said, I want people to think about things. That also is a way for people not to have to think quite as much. So I generally use 5.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Oh.
Thank you.
Happy to
Very
help.
nice to meet you all.
It's very nice. And I'll post these, and if you have any questions about the video or you need us to do anything, just let us know.
Yeah, and I will also post my slides on SlideShare.
Oh, thank you very much. We can surely use the link.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, and we'll keep on touch. I'm going to take about 2 weeks to translate this because I need a video expert to subtitle, but I'll let you know as soon as I have them. And Catherine, I'll send you the invitation letter maybe this afternoon or tomorrow morning.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you very much.
And be in touch if you have any other questions or need anything else from us.
Absolutely.
And have a good summer.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Great talking to you. Bye-bye. Okay. Bye-bye.